104.1 The Hawk. It's Bob and Tom in the morning and classic rock all day. And I have a special guest on the phone with me right now, Brooke Halpin, a classically trained musician, award-winning composer, Beatle expert extraordinaire, published author, and he's got a new book out called Experiencing the Beatles, A Listener's Companion. Hey, Brooke.
Hey, Richard. How are you?
I am good, sir. And you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
I'm going to, the first question, why another Beatle book?
Yeah, exactly. There's so many Beatle books out there.
I think I own them all.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. We like that, Richard.
There you go. So keep writing them. I'll keep buying them. But anyway,
love it.
What's the angle on this book that makes it unique?
I had no interest in rewriting that, which has already been written. So I was talking with the publisher, and I said, how about if I create time capsule travel vignettes so that the reader, when they read my book, will be in my shoes back in the days when the Beatles were together. So instead of me turning on the black transistor radio, the Zenith transistor radio, and hearing All My Lovin', you turn on your transistor radio and you hear All My Lovin', and you go to the record shop and buy the 45 single, for 89 cents, and you run home and put it on your hi-fi and listen to Please Please Me. So that really is the thing that differentiates my book from all the other Beatle books out there.
Now, people like me who grew up in that Beatle era, we kind of have those moments in time probably that relate to the Beatle timeline. I can remember this time of my life, and that's the Sgt. Pepper time of my life, and I remember this time of my life, and that's the White Album time of my life. So this is kind of that.
Exactly. And because, since you are of a certain age, you had the experience, I guess, when the Beatles were together, some similar to myself. But for those people out there who are younger, who want to know more about the Beatles, and they haven't, obviously, the opportunity to do what you and I did. This is a vehicle. My book is a vehicle for them to actually experience the Beatles through what I and someone like yourself experienced when the Beatles were together. And for someone like yourself, people our age, what happens when they read this book is what? They are brought back to something that they experienced as well. And, of course, it's very exciting to relive the thoughts and the memories and the emotions that you and I had when the Beatles were together when we listened to the White Album for the first time in December 1968.
The name of the book is Experiencing the Beatles, A Listener's Companion, available on Amazon. I'm talking to the author, Brooke Halpin. Now, I'm going to ask you once again what's your favorite kid? You can't answer that question, but in this, you have different chapters. Is there certain one? Pick a chapter that just really orchestrated with you and just was something special for you?
Well, I'll tell you, I, like yourself, Richard, have read just about every Beatle book that's been published. But in all the books that I've read, I have never heard much about the other musicians who played on the Beatles recordings. For instance, who's playing the piccolo trumpet on Penny Lane?
Right.
Who plays the French horn on For No One? Right?
Right.
Who plays the flute and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away? Who plays the harp and She's Leaving Home? So my favorite chapter in that respect is the last chapter called Gifted Extras, Guest Musicians Revealed.
That's good stuff, because that you have a whole chapter of trivia questions for me.
That's true. There you go.
So people who listen on my Request Lunch show when I do the trivia, you're going to have to buy the book because all the Beatle questions are coming out of Brooke's book.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love it.
Hey, something else then. And I know you're a Beatle expert and you've done a lot of research as well as stuff about the Beatles. One of the things I found is sometimes there's different stories out there. Sometimes they don't mesh. And one of the things I noticed about the Beatles themselves is they don't refute any of them. They just let all the stories float out there. So how do you know when you're talking about folklore and when you're talking about truth?
That's a great question. Well, I'll give you an example. The Beatles, as you probably know, Richard, they loved having fun with their fans. And when they got into, I would say, around 66, definitely 67 and 68, they were playing tricks on us. I mean, they were doing these backward things, and you turn the record backwards and you hear, "Turn me on, dead man, turn me on, dead man," which is number 9, number 9. And to this very day, McCartney and Starr, the only surviving Beatles, they would never admit that they were playing tricks and having fun with us. But I really believe, because there's so many bloody clues, there's not just like 1, 2, 3, 5, 10. There's dozens of clues where they were playing this game like Paul is dead. Now, I know Paul is not dead, okay. But from a marketing perspective back then, what happened? We all ran out and bought all the other albums that we didn't have just to listen to the clues. I mean, it's a brilliant marketing way to increase record sales, right? But they would never admit that. So that's one of those things that's very, very cloudy. You know, it's definitely gray. It's not black and white for sure.
Once again, we're talking to Brooke Halpin, Experiencing the Beatles, a listener's companion. What other things, if you're not a Beatle expert like yourself, would you find revealing in the book that someone would really enjoy as they're going through it? What kind of things are in there that people might stumble across and go, wow, that's some cool stuff right there?
Okay, well, there's a lot of things, like, for instance, when they were performing live. Now, they toured, as you know, the U.S. in 64, 65, and 66. So the question is, you know, why did they stop touring in 66? Do you know why, Richard? What are your thoughts? Why do you think they stopped touring?
I'm going to say because they couldn't recreate the sounds of the newer albums, and people weren't listening to them anyway because they were screaming so much.
Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah, they couldn't really hear what they were doing on stage, so they weren't really having as much fun as anymore. I mean, you look at the first concert they did in Washington, D.C. in February 1964. I don't know if you've ever seen the footage of that thing.
Yeah, they have to turn the drum. They have to turn the drum around every couple songs.
That's right, because they were playing in the Coliseum.
They're in the round.
It's a boxing ring. It was a bloody boxing ring. That's what they were. They were in the round, so they had to turn around because they didn't want to be rude, you know, by having their backs toward the audience. But of course, they couldn't avoid it every time they played somewhere because someone was in the back of them or facing the other way. So, you know, the thing about '66, of course, which was really, really unfortunate, and people don't know this, is that Brian Epstein, who took care of the band like they were his boys, he was ready to cancel the entire 1966 tour because he felt as though, because John said, if you remember, that he thought that in terms of teenagers, people like myself, that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Now, if someone said to me in 1966 when I was about 15 and said, hey, Brooke, would you rather go to church today or at the same time the Beatles are playing down the road, you know, what would you rather do? Now, you know I would go see the Beatles, and that's what John was talking about, right?
Right.
Okay. So, but unfortunately, you know, down in the Bible Belt, the DJ got hold of this story that John had set into publication back in London 3 months ago, and it became this big band, the Beatles, and they were burning the Beatle records and smashing them and destroying it. And so Brian was afraid that John might get killed. So he called up his other attorney that he worked with, Nat Weiss in New York City, and Brian said, hey, Nat, what would it cost to cancel the tour? Now, at this point, they had already booked the whole tour across the country, right? And Nat says, $1 million. This is 1966. Now, $1 million is a lot of friggin' money back then, right? Okay. So what does Brian say? Brian say, fine, I'll write you a check. So Brian was willing, ready to sign a check to cancel the entire tour. But when he talked with the Beatles didn't want to be defeated and feel like, hey, wait a minute. No, this is what we do. We want to play. Let's go out and play for our fans. So that's a very interesting piece of history that I don't think a lot of people know about.
I remember a story where at one of the shows a firecracker went off and they looked at each other because they thought one of them might have been shot and killed right there on the stage.
That's exactly right, and that was in Memphis. That's where that happened. Yep, and people thought, well, Paul, George, and Ringo thought that John got shot, and they all turned, quickly to see him, and thank God he was still standing. But yeah, you're right. So that's a good example of the kind of vibes that were going on at the time. And plus, when they went to the Philippines, it was a whole mess because they didn't go to the Royal Palace for breakfast. So there were all these things. You put them all together, and they thought, you know what? That's it. Candlestick. That's the last time. And after Candlestick, actually, George Harrison said in so many words, I'm no longer a Beatle.
Yeah. They didn't think they could be the Beatles without touring. Obviously, they had many more years to come in the recording studio, which we're thankful for.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a whole chapter, by the way, called Recording Studio Wizardry, which covers their psychedelic and electronic songs.
And that's some of the best stuff they gave us, too.
Oh, my God. I mean,
getting them off the road actually made for some great music. So as much as we didn't get to go see them live, we probably got better records because of it.
oh, absolutely, because the recording studio became their laboratory, if you will. And that's where, of course, they had the unlimited hours. I mean, for instance, on the song I Will, which is on the White Album, do you know how many takes they made of that one song? Paul went through that song 67 times.
And it's about a minute and a half.
It's a short tune. When they did their first album, they recorded the whole bloody album in one day.
Exactly. That's the voice of Brooke Halpin. The book is called Experiencing Beatles, A Listener's Companion, a new take, putting you in the place of Beatlemania and the Beatle time and place, kind of a time capsule for those of you who weren't there and kind of nostalgia for those of us who were. Brooke, thank you for your time. The book is available through Amazon and everywhere else you can get a book these days, right?
Yeah, Barnes & Noble as well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your time, and if you're a Beatle fan, get the book, and thank you for your time, Brooke.
Thanks so much, Richard.